a Category 5 hurricane with such a well-formed eye. When you look down at it, flying over in the station, it doesn't even look like it's moving, but you know the power that's at the center of that storm and what havoc that storm is wreaking on everybody on the ground.
You look at it in terror, really, because you know all the people that are endangered underneath, but just the immensity of power that Mother Nature brings.
A hurricane, a thunderstorm, everywhere you look, there is the environment doing something crazy. So we're coming up over Brazil, about to go across into the Atlantic Ocean, and looking out on the horizon, I saw looked kind of brown. I'd never seen that really from the space station. And I instantly, what did I think? Human interaction pollution, for sure. It's just awful looking, it's terrible. But as we went over the Atlantic, it kind of got thicker and thicker and thicker. It was a sandstorm in the Sahara Desert, blowing this huge plume of sand up into the atmosphere, crossing the Atlantic Ocean and coming down in Brazil. I mean, that is crazy. If that doesn't change the way you think about the planet, absolutely nothing will.
What struck me was when we looked at natural disasters, you see a flood, and you really can't pick out where they are on Earth. But when you see it from space, you realize that the effects of these natural disasters really hit everybody equally. And it really gives you this perspective that, first of all, we're all in this together, and that the world is very small.
What has always struck me every time I went there is how beautiful the Earth is, how fragile it looks, how alive it obviously is with the clouds, the water. It's like it's breathing.
When you first look at Earth, you may say, wow, that's a continent. And then you look at it again the next day and you say, wow, there are mountain ranges. And then you look at it again the next day and it's like, oh, I could see synclines and anticlines in the geologic structure.
You could see the Nile River and the Nile Delta, so clearly the Red Sea. And for me, that was just amazing to look down. You could see the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea. And I was just like, this is where all this took place.
The color palette is hard to compare. I mean, all these reds and oranges, and so the dunes all over in Central Africa and in Saudi Arabia, you have these so many different textures.
And you can almost pick out where you are over the Earth because Australia's tans are different than African tans.
Every piece of the Earth has its own tone, if you want. So you become very acquainted with the Earth from a big picture point of view.
And you saw the beauty of the landscape and the mountains and the deserts, and you start to think of how they were formed. You realize just how special the place we are is, and you feel that connection.
So when you look at the Earth from that vantage point, I know others have said this, you don't see the borders. You don't see political borders. You hardly see geographical borders.
We're so used to looking at maps or globes in low Earth orbit, you don't see a globe. And from no distance do you see the different colors for countries so that it makes them easy to distinguish.
I was looking for all the little pink and green countries when I was looking at where's Uganda? It's supposed to be pink on the atlas.
You don't see those geopolitical boundaries, all of the man-made boundaries that we've imposed upon ourselves as humans. You don't see any of that from space.
It's just you and your team, and you're trying to make an impact on us evolving into something more. You forget about the politics. You forget about daily life that plagues us here on the ground, that colors our perceptions because you're insulated from it.
And you just feel this sense of commonality more, and something that unites us all, and just that we're all human.
Flying over Africa in the daytime with intense sunlight so much of the time, you don't really see much detail. It's so bright. But at night, when it's illuminated by starlight or moonlight, you really see a lot, and it's just fascinating.
And you don't quite see the same texture, but you see mankind's influence on the planet.
You get these beautiful, twinkly city lights.
And they represent human sprawl, which isn't necessarily bad, but it is incredibly beautiful from space.
I love looking at the atmosphere at night when you have that air glow, and sometimes it was a bit green, and then you have the aurora dancing around.
And we were flying into this astonishing aurora, this rippling, pulsing river of green that's down below us, the red that is stretching up to our altitude. It's like, it was just breathtaking.
Auroras, the presence of humans at night, it's obvious with the lights. But it's the death around the Earth that's startling. How this beautiful, shining oasis of life is there naked in the middle of pitch black death, a vacuum of space.
Definitely look up and see the stars like you have never seen them before. I mean, the Milky Way is just stunning.
There's many things in the cosmos to gaze at it. For example, the Magellanic Clouds. Those show up really bright and vivid because you don't have atmospheric scattering. You can see Andromeda, the spiral galaxy of Andromeda.
Of course, the lights don't flicker. They're steady because they're not coming through the dust and coming through the atmosphere. And then as you really adjust, you start to sense the very subtle colors that are in the stars. A little bit of reddish, a little bit of bluish, blue-white.
Just all the colors and the light come out, in that depth of space as well.
I could all of a sudden detect depth. Now, I couldn't tell you how much, but it's light years, right? And it's like, whoa, I can somehow tell that star is closer than that star. And that was something that knocked my socks off. And I thought, nobody told me about this.
I don't think I had thought before going up there about how many stars you see, the density of stars.
You see so many stars, it becomes hard to pick out constellations. People ask if there's aliens, and I'm like, of course there are aliens. Look at all those stars. There's got to be.
It's just so vast and infinite. I don't know what else to say about that.
I remember using like the 800 millimeter lens and just really zooming into places. And, you still can't see people walking around or anything, but you see impacts of things. And you realize that a lot of times we have to pull way back. You have to pull way back and see the big picture of it.
You realize just how small you are, because you at times struggle to find evidence of human activity down there. You can go over massive swaths of the Earth and not see a trace of any human impact. Or you can go over other swaths and you can see dramatic impact.
Frequently, in the summertime, there's a lot of fires in Africa. You see all of those plumes of smoke heading west across the Atlantic.
You fly over South America and you see, widespread deforestation, and the impact that has. You can almost get a sense of the balance of, how nature is trying to balance all the inputs and the outputs and have a stable system. And you can see our effect on it.
To me, it started to make me understand that everything is connected. What is happening in the ocean over here can affect what is happening on land over here. It's just all one being, thing, and it's all interconnected.
You can see combat. I mean, we were two countries were at war, and you could very easily see missiles being shot. They just look like little tiny traces of light. You can see all that stuff. So to me, I didn't see one unified human civilization. You certainly see one unified planet cruising around the sun, and that is a unique perspective.
But during my time on space station, I had the chance to do a spacewalk, put on a spacesuit, and go outside. And that's a very special experience for any astronaut.
You're inside the space station or the shuttle, and now you put on a suit and go outside. It's like there is an elevation and risk when you do that, but it is a bit thrilling.
Spacewalks always seem to be very busy and task-focused events where I got to do this, and I got to move over here and do this. And
then you just have to not think about where you are. Just concentrate on getting the job done. What's the big picture?
Rarely did you have a minute where you could just say, just take a minute and enjoy the view. But, there were those minutes every once in a while. And the view from outside the spacecraft, with that full panoramic vision through your helmet visor, was just incredible.
It's a very disturbing view, looking down about 240 miles at the Earth going by at 17,000 miles an hour. It's like, oh boy.
I just watched the Earth going by below me, and I only had this, thin visor separating me from a very unsurvivable atmosphere. And my feet were dangling. I remember, not just through my visor, but looking down, and you just see feet and then Earth, and you're holding on to the space station. And it was just incredible. Everything looked so large.
The colors are even more vibrant. And I think also just mentally, psychologically realizing that, there's nothing between the vacuum of space except for this spacesuit and your visor.
I remember thinking that coming out, like that the world would just open up around me. And the view, for some reason, seems bigger than what you have when you're looking through the windows of a spacecraft.
It wasn't like Earth is over there. It wasn't small. It was like it took up your entire, visor and all as far as you could see, and just watching it come over Earth, and just how large Earth was from our perspective.
But oh my gosh, you see Earth, and you see your glowing station around you, and you realize, okay, I gotta stop looking at this stuff, because it becomes a distraction to the work that you're doing out there.
so I always kid those astronauts that don't do the spacewalks. I said, the view from inside here through this flat window is pretty good. The view from outside is just amazing.
And the great thing about living on space station, I loved every minute of it. I had a countdown going, but it was, oh no, I only have 2 months left.
All right, one last look at the Earth. This is some good news. The Earth is still beautiful. An Earth in crisis is still an Earth worth returning to.
Life seems extremely busy, and the days start flying by, and before you know it, it's over.
As it drew to a close, I think I was more feeling as though, did you do enough to capture this so that you can share it when you get home? And so that you can light those fires in people as you go around and talk about this and try to, ignite the passion in kids just like I had ignited for me as a kid.
man, you're back on the ground, and somebody else is doing the job up there now. It makes you feel like, this is a really big thing that we're a part of, and I'm fortunate to play my part.
It is the fact that going to space and seeing the Earth from that vantage point has a life-changing effect on most of us.
It takes a lot of energy to describe what it's like up there, because there's so much of your emotion built into it.
I think the best way to describe it is that your viewpoint changes. That you can look at the same thing, but it changes the lens through which you see it.
And that acute concrete realization that we belong to Earth and not vice versa, it's kind of a mental shift to see that we just nowhere else we could go.
I think if you're not a conservationist before you go to space, you're at least partly a conservationist when you come back, because when you see how thin that atmosphere is, that protective layer that we have here, you think, wow, we really have to take care of this because it does look so fragile from space.
I think I felt that need to protect it even before leaving it, but it definitely does resonate even more loudly now, having seen it myself, and how stunning and beautiful it is. All of those unique ecosystems, everything's connected, the land masses and the ocean masses and the atmosphere, and we are all in it together. We are all down there. And so I think that's the most important thing that I would encourage people to think about, that perspective.
I think you get a sense of preservation of I don't want this to go away, and I don't want to be the only one to see this. And there are so many people that need to see it, but only a handful will in this lifetime.
I remember coming back from all my missions with that sense that, we're all connected, we're all people. And I thought about, why is it that we do have conflicts? What is that separates us from one another?
If you could get 7 billion people to go up there and look down for just even 30 seconds, you would change them, all of them, forever. They wouldn't all come back and be friends. They wouldn't all come back and tear down border walls and things like that. But you would change all of them, and you would change them all for the better, and they would have a different view of the planet.
I think if people that can lift their eyes up and see the bigger picture, whether it's from orbit or even just understanding the different sides, maybe spending more time listening, rather than shouting.
And that's what I want people to find. I absolutely found that in the experience I had in space, in the simple facts of us living on a planet and all being Earthlings, and the only border that matters is that thin blue line.
Mission and liftoff. Touchdown confirmed. Hello, United States.
To explore every phase of cosmic history.
Well, in my left hand, I have a feather. In my right hand, a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago, who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather.
Welcome to the Quest airlock on the International Space Station. I'm Ricky Arnold, Expedition 56 flight engineer from NASA. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, extravehicular activity, or EVA. Going out on an EVA or a spacewalk has been one of the most amazing experiences of my life. But it's also one of the most complicated and dangerous things we do during human spaceflight. There's a lot of equipment to prepare and maintain, and we do months of training to make each EVA a success. If you think it sounds complicated, you should see all of it in action. Let's start with training and how we get ready for a spacewalk.
Space is an extreme environment that presents many hazards. If we're going to go outside the safety of the ISS, we have to be prepared. That's why EVAs are designed with safety as the utmost priority. We astronauts spend a lot of time in the classroom, just like you are now, learning about the hardware we'll be using and the specific parts of the space station we'll be working on. Then we get to go spend a lot of time training in NASA's giant pool, called the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, or NBL. Since it's impossible to simulate microgravity on Earth, the next best option is water, 6.2 million gallons of it. The NBL is 40 feet deep, 202 feet in length, and 102 feet in width. A lot of room to have a full-scale working model of the ISS, which we need for practicing our EVA maneuvers and assigned tasks. We get suited up and weighted so that we're neutrally buoyant in the water, so we don't sink to the bottom and we don't float to the surface. It's a great way to simulate the microgravity we'll be experiencing. We do several dress rehearsals of the EVA before we launch. This gives us the opportunity to prepare for any anomalies that may occur. We spend at least 5 hours practicing the NBL for every 1 hour planned for the spacewalk. So we are very well prepared to execute the EVAs once we are in orbit. Once we are up in orbit, the EVA preparation continues. First, we must perform a pre-breathe protocol to displace the nitrogen in our tissues and help prevent a condition called decompression sickness. During pre-breathe, we breathe 100% pure oxygen and do some light exercise to help purge the nitrogen from our bodies. During pre-breathe, we will also don our extravehicular mobility unit, or EMU. This is a fancy name for a spacesuit. The spacesuit is basically its own spacecraft, shaped like a human. There is usually a red stripe on the leg of one astronaut, but not the other, so the ground can tell who is who. To ensure our safety at all times, we are always aware of our safety tethers and where we are in relation to our spacewalking buddy.
Hey, buddy.
There's a fellow crew member called the IV, the intervehicular crew, on the inside of the airlock, watching and communicating with us as the EVA progresses. We are also prepared for several contingencies should they occur. First, we are trained on the use of a jetpack that can be used to maneuver in the event of an emergency rescue. It's called a SAFER, or Simplified Aid for EVA Rescue. The view during an EVA is magnificent. It's beautiful out there. It's also extremely dangerous, but our months of preparation and all of those dedicated people working on the ground, working around the clock, ensure we are safe as possible when we work outside the ISS. EVAs have allowed us to build and maintain the ISS, repair mission-critical hardware, investigate malfunctions, install new hardware, and the view, unbelievable. See you next time.
Hello, I'm astronaut Randy Bresnik. Want to know one of the best parts about being an astronaut up in space? Our view of the Earth from the International Space Station is absolutely spectacular. And viewing the Earth from space is a big part of our job. In addition to many other important functions, the International Space Station serves as a global monitoring and diagnosis station where we can conduct observations across the globe, aimed at understanding and resolving environmental issues we face on our home planet. Let's have a look. The space station offers a unique vantage point for observing the Earth's ecosystems with hands-on and automated cameras and image capture equipment. These tools enable astronauts to both observe and explain what they're witnessing in real time. The image capture equipment on the space station also provides input to personnel back on Earth, working to program the station's automated Earth sensing systems, providing flexibility and an advantage over sensors on unmanned spacecraft and satellites. Scientists and researchers find this especially useful when unexpected natural events such as volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, hurricanes, fires, and other natural disasters like floods occur. Through existing international and interagency partnerships fundamental to the International Space Station, data sharing that can benefit people around the world is facilitated, promoting international collaboration on a range of Earth observation activities. A wide variety of Earth observation equipment can be attached to the space station's exterior, like I did on one of my spacewalks. Several instruments have already been installed, and researchers from around the globe are proposing additional payloads to install. And continuing to use a combination of crew-operated and automated Earth observation payloads, the space station collects crucial data on the global climate, environmental change, and potential hazards to the health of humanity and our home planet. The Window Observational Research Facility, or as we call it, the WARF, provides a highly stable internal mounting platform to hold cameras and sensors. With the WARF, the high-quality optics of the nadir, or the bottom viewing window of the space station, allows us to look straight down onto Earth. Do you want to participate in some of our Earth observation missions? Come join us. Check out the Sally Ride EarthCam website. Go to earthcam.org and follow the instructions to sign up. And have a look at some of the spectacular Earth views from space and see what you can identify. You can also try the activity in the link we provided in the description of this video. Thanks for joining me. See you all next time.
Hi, I'm Sunny Williams, and I'm an astronaut who's lived and worked aboard the International Space Station, an amazing research laboratory that's orbiting the Earth about 250 miles above us. While we're at the space station, we astronauts live and work in a microgravity environment. Do you think the laws of physics will hold up in the space station while experiencing microgravity? Let's check with NASA astronaut Mark Vande Hei on the International Space Station to find out.
Newton's first law of motion says an object at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted on by an outside force. Also, an object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted on by an outside force, like my finger.
Let's look at this from another angle. Over time, the International Space Station slows down from experiencing a very small amount of drag, or force, from a tiny amount of atomic oxygen in space. This is like the force you feel from the air if you stick your hand out of a moving car. Because of this, the space station does what we call a reboost. A reboost uses rocket engines to put a force on the space station. This allows it to speed up just a little to remain in orbit around the Earth. Let's join NASA astronaut Jeff Williams to check out what happens to the objects inside the space station when it begins.
Now, the way I'm going to demonstrate the acceleration that comes during the reboost is by using this camera. 800 millimeter lens, so it's pretty massive actually. And you can see I can float it here, and there's no reboost going on right now, so the camera's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to slowly drift due to the ventilation, or if I put any velocity into it, it'll drift out of the scene. But I'm going to try to hold it here steady, and you can see that it stays very steady. There's my camera. I'm setting it up for ignition. There it goes. It actually came a little bit early. Now watch the camera accelerate toward you. There it goes. I'm going to reach out and grab it and bring it back in the view here. And I'm holding it. I'm actually feeling the acceleration. I'm going to let go again. And here it goes. It's going to take off. I'll try not to let it hit you. Just going to miss you. Yeah, I'm going to let go now. And here I go, drifting back toward you again. So the acceleration applies to me too. Reached our 2.7 meters per second that we desired. And now if I let go of the camera, it's not going anywhere. So the burn is over. Reboost complete. We'll stay in orbit for a little while longer.
Can you use Newton's first law to explain why the camera began moving without an astronaut putting a force directly on it? I'm going to send you back to class so you can start to investigate this with the classroom connection found at nasa.gov/demonstrations. Thanks for exploring a little physics on the space station with us today. See you again soon.
Hi there. My name is Anne McLean, and I'm an astronaut who has lived and worked 250 miles above the Earth's surface on the International Space Station. Today, we're going to be turning our eyes toward the moon and learning more about what causes the moon phases. But before we check out the moon phases, let's take a look at where the space station is compared to where we are on Earth and where the moon and the sun are. On Earth, you're only about 250 miles below the station. The moon, however, is located 238,855 miles on average from Earth. You could fit 30 Earths in that distance. When you think about how far away we are from you on the station versus how far away the moon is, the station is only a tiny bit closer to the moon than we are here on Earth. And that's only when the station is in orbit on the same side of Earth as the moon. So the station is 250 miles away, the moon is 238,855 miles away, and the sun is approximately 92,900,000 miles away. That is quite the distance. Now that you know where you are relative to the station, moon, and the sun, let's talk about the moon phases. Now, when you're looking up at the moon from the Earth, you'll notice that it looks different from day to day. We call these differences the phases of the moon, and they cycle through every 30 days. Let's check out a demonstration of the moon phases here on the ground. We're going to pretend his head is Earth, letting him view the moon as you would from your home. The ball in their hand is going to represent the moon, and the light source is going to be our sun. Keep in mind that while the moon is orbiting Earth, Earth is also rotating on its axis and slowly orbiting the sun. Now, looking from our outsider perspective, we can see the moon is still whole the entire time it is orbiting around Earth, with the side facing the sun always illuminated and reflecting sunlight. Let's take a look at what he is seeing. As you can see in the photographs from Earth's view, the reflection of sunlight looks quite different from this angle, since we are only able to see parts of the reflected sunlight as the moon moves around Earth. This is what causes our moon phases, as the moon orbits around Earth every 30 days. There are names for each of the phases of the moon's 30-day cycle. When the moon looks completely dark, we're experiencing a new moon. This is the beginning of the 30-day cycle. It will move through a waxing crescent phase until it is a first quarter moon. From here, we will see a waxing gibbous until the moon appears fully illuminated. You might have heard this phase before. This is what we call a full moon. After this phase, the moon will go from a waning gibbous phase into a third quarter moon. After the third quarter moon, it will become a waning crescent until it returns to a new moon. On the space station, we see the same moon phases as we do on the Earth's surface. Since the space station is only 250 miles closer to the moon than we are here on the ground, astronauts on the station have the same perspective you have, but don't have the Earth's atmosphere in their way for photographs. Astronauts currently on the space station actually use the moon's phases to collect research that will help NASA with the Artemis program as we work to go forward to the moon with our astronauts by 2024. So, the next time you're outside, take a glance up at the moon to check out what phase it's in. Are you interested in seeing the space station fly by as well? Ask an adult to help you sign up for Spot the Station at spotthestation.nasa.gov. Thanks for learning with me today. See you next time.
Hey there, I'm NASA astronaut Ricky Arnold. Welcome aboard the International Space Station. Today we're going to talk about the Space Station Truss. The truss segment is just about 100 meters from side to side. A truss is a segment or part of the whole integrated truss structure. The trusses are used to support the 16 solar array panels, which provide energy for us, and radiators which get rid of excess heat that builds up inside the space station. The design of the truss involves triangles and beams, which can be seen on Earth in structures like bridges. Why triangles? Well, this is because of their unique geometric properties, their methods of transferring loads, and their spatial openness. Triangles are more rigid than rectangular shapes because they have fewer joints. The larger number of joints in a shape, the more prone that shape is to being impacted by shear forces. what I'd like to talk a little bit about today is some of the forces that can act upon the truss. Well, the first force I want to talk about is compression force. And compression force is just like it sounds, two things coming together. So if we apply a compression force to the truss, what do you think is going to happen? Well, let me go ahead and do it. And you can see right here where the truss would bend. What do you think the opposite force of compression is? Yeah, it's going to be pulling apart. We call that a tension force. And a tension force is what's going to help maybe even rigidize the truss segment, but it also could potentially pull it apart. I'm not going to pull apart this tape measure because we probably need it later for some work we have to do. Now, if you look carefully, this next force I want to talk about is basically kind of like a twisting force, and we call it torsion. And even when I just let go of the tape measure, you can see it will actually start to happen a little bit. You can start to see, because the center of mass is actually right here, where most of the tape measure is located. And when I let it go, the tape measure itself starts to twist just a little bit. Finally, the fourth force that can act along a truss segment is that can occur at a single point where two opposing forces work on a single point along the truss, just like they can upon the Earth's surface. Think about some earthquakes. You can have a plate that is, or along a fault line where one side of the fault line is moving upward or being forced upward, while the other side is moving downward. And that force in one point in opposite directions is called a shear force. And we can also have that happen on the truss segment. Something like this. One thing to think about, where do these forces come from? One force, even though we're up here largely out of the Earth's atmosphere, we do still have drag with the Earth's atmosphere, which can impart loads on or impart a force on the truss segment. Another, I already hinted at earlier, is crew working inside. We're up here, we're exercising, we're moving really heavy pieces of equipment around. So we have an amazing engineering team on the ground, and we have specific disciplines that their job is to monitor all the forces imparted upon the International Space Station. They keep track of all those various forces I talked about and where they could be coming from, the atmosphere, visiting vehicles, or even things that the crew are doing inside the space station, and to make sure that those forces aren't significant enough to cause any damage to this wonderful laboratory and living space we have up here in low Earth orbit. Thanks so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time. So long. So we are standing in the Quest airlock, which is divided into two parts. We have the equipment lock and we have the crew lock. This equipment lock has a hatch right here that closes, and the crew lock has another hatch. The EMU, or the Extravehicular Mobility Unit, is our spacesuit, and it's divided roughly into two parts. We have the hard upper torso, which is almost like a turtle shell. It's a hard fiberglass shell, and then we also have the lower torso assembly. These spacesuits are our own little spacecraft, and they have everything you need to keep you alive out in space for 7 to 8 hours, maybe even longer, depending on how hard you're working. The only thing that they do not have, and they have radios, it has oxygen, it has carbon dioxide scrubbing, it has temperature control, it has everything you need except for one thing, a restroom. And so when we get ready for our EVA, the first thing we put on in the morning is a diaper. And that's our first layer. Then over the diaper, we put on a pair of long johns, and that's to keep our arms and legs from getting scraped up. It also provides a little bit of wicking in case you're getting really hot and sweaty. The next layer is our liquid cooling garment. And the LCVG has little tubes running through it, which allow water to circulate inside the LCVG to provide cooling when we're outside working really hard. So we've got the diaper, we got long johns, we got the LCVG, and then we're going to wear our spacesuit. 7 layers from the bladder on the inside, which maintains pressure, and that's a rubberized bladder, all the way out to the white layer on the outside. The crew member inside the spacesuit is also wearing this, what we call a Snoopy cap. It's a communications cap. We have a radio, so we can talk to not only to Houston, but we can talk to people on the space station and to each other. So we wear this communication cap inside the helmet. Also, another key component of the EMU or a spacesuit is the helmet. You can see the helmet has a gold visor, which protects us from the rays of the sun that we can bring down. It's pretty bright out there, and this gold visor helps reflect the rays of the sun so we can actually see and operate in daylight. At nighttime, we can raise this visor up, gives us a clearer view, and additionally, we have helmet lights built into the helmet. On top of the helmet, we also have a television camera, so the ground is able to watch us while we work through these TV cameras. The work is really all done with hands, and so our gloves are really our most important piece of equipment in order for us to work outside. And one of the real challenges of a spacewalk is you have this heavy gloved hand, which is inflated, so it wants to stay like it's blown up like a balloon. But we walk by grabbing onto handrails and making our way along the ISS. So every time you move your hand, you're fighting against a balloon that wants to inflate. And then on top of that, all of our equipment is based on using your hands too. So after 6.5, 7 hours of kind of fighting against this glove, it's a really long day, and your hands are probably the thing that are most exhausted after 7 hours out on an EVA. Well, we're going out to work. You probably saw me move this mini workstation. The way we carry our tools is on a mini workstation, which is carried on the front. Every single tool we use is tethered to us. We do not want to accidentally create satellites. Our primary way of remaining attached to the ISS, if we're not using our hands, are these waist tethers. And you can see they just have a big hook. They go around a rail or anything else on the ISS and latch on, and it actually has a locking mechanism as well to hold us nice and tight. So we always want to have one of these attached if we're not holding on with our hands as well. The back of the EMU has our life support system. The life support system contains all the equipment we need, from a UHF radio down to the oxygen tanks that provide primary oxygen. One of the challenges inside this sealed environment, it's very easy to carry our own oxygen with us, but we generate a lot of carbon dioxide, particularly when we're out there working very hard. So to combat that, to deal with that, we have these canisters called Medox canisters, which are just silver oxide. They are carried in the backpack along with a very large battery, which provides all the electricity for us. I don't have a battery here to show you today because we're in the process of charging them. We're about a month out from doing a spacewalk, and we've already started getting ready for that. So this Medox canister is able to remove about 7 to 8 hours of carbon dioxide that a human can generate inside the spacesuit. EVAs have allowed us to build and maintain the ISS, repair mission-critical hardware, investigate malfunctions, install new hardware, and the view, unbelievable. See you next time.
Hi, my name is Ricky Arnold on the International Space Station. We get asked a lot, how do we sleep in space? And it's a great question because we all know how important a good night's sleep is. If you're not getting a good night's sleep, you can count on reduced cognitive function, poorer reaction times, and maybe just being a little grumpy. And up here in space, just like on Earth, those are things we all want to avoid. So we go around the Earth about every 90 minutes, which means we get 16 sunrises and sunsets a day. So how we sleep is a really good question because the sun's always getting ready to come up or it's getting ready to set. And we use those cues on Earth to let us know when it's time to begin our day and when it's time to end our day.
Ricky is talking about circadian rhythm. It's the body's natural regulator for sleep and wake cycles based on a 24-hour schedule. Those 16 sunrises and sunsets he mentioned can cause circadian misalignment and sleep deficiencies during long-duration spaceflight. The hazards of lost sleep can range from poor attention at school to on-the-job errors to long-term sleep loss, even chronic disease. Sleep is super important. Hey, Ricky, what are you doing on the space station to get some sleep?
Well, here in space, we kind of have to do it artificially. So we have these nice crew quarters. It's about the size of a refrigerator. It's very quiet. The space station can be a little noisy, but it's very quiet in here. And we can control light with a light switch. If we are just middle of the day, we have a light like you're seeing right now, which is just this kind of standard lighting. It's getting close to the end of the evening. You want to dim the light a little bit. kind of for the end of the evening, or if you're going to be up late and need to keep awake, we have a really bright light setting. The other thing we have is off. You see how dark it got. Another challenge sleeping on the International Space Station, sleeping in microgravity is really nice because you can just float and stretch out and it's really comfortable. The problem is with the air currents in the International Space Station, you could very well float into a piece of hardware and hit your head, or worse yet, even break something. So we got our sleeping bag here, just almost like a sleeping bag on Earth. But as you can see, we have bungee cords that help hold us up against the wall. So I almost sleep standing up. And also, I do have a pillow. It's just a bag full of clothes. But I actually keep it up on the top of my head because I'm a little tall. In the crew quarters, I tend to hit my head on the ceiling when I'm sleeping. So I got my sleeping bag here. I got my bungee cords to hold me in. And then when it's time to go to bed, it's quite easy. Just unzip the sleeping bag, climb on under the bungee cord, climb into the sleeping bag, make sure you're nice and secure, zip yourself up, plan on getting a good night's sleep so I have good reaction times, my cognitive ability is what it should be, and that I'm not grumpy in the morning. So with that, I'm all set. Good night from the ISS. Hi, welcome aboard the International Space Station. I'm astronaut Ricky Arnold, and I'm currently at one of our human research facilities on ISS, where you can see centrifuges, laptops, and other scientific equipment. Across from me is another one of these experiment racks, where you can see ultrasound imaging, more laptops, cameras, other equipment, all stuff that requires electrical power. In fact, we have so much equipment for science and life support that our electrical system has about 8 miles or 13 kilometers of wiring to make it all work. So where does this energy come from? Let's have a look. From here in the cupola and through other windows, you can easily see the solar arrays soaking in the sunlight. They are massive. These 4 solar arrays are made of solar cells, which are purified chunks of the element silica. Together, the solar arrays contain a total of 262,400 solar cells and cover an area of about 27,000 square feet, more than half the area of a football field. That's huge. When the station is in sunlight, the solar arrays produce about 60% more power than we actually need during the daytime. That extra power goes directly to charging our lithium-ion batteries. Now, those batteries are essential because they provide the power we need during the 16 night times we have per day here on the space station. The energy our solar arrays can produce is enough to power 40 homes, and we can maximize the power we generate by rotating the arrays in 2 axes, one like a windmill to track the sun through the course of the day, the other to track the sun's inclination, or its angle in the sky. The space station's electrical power system uses direct current to provide energy for our laptops, lights, water recovery system, and science experiments. Thanks for coming aboard today. Now back to Earth.
It's a new era of pioneers, star sailors, thinkers, and adventurers.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
Let's go.
We have been given the scientific knowledge, the technical ability, and the materials to pursue the exploration of the universe.
Across the nation, are sacred sites that capture the spirit of America's character. And one of those places is right here, the Kennedy Space Center.
Every single vehicle that has carried humans beyond the bounds of low Earth orbit has undergone integration and testing in that vehicle assembly building, crawled down this roadway and launched right here from the Kennedy Space Center. The Space Launch System, mated with the Orion spacecraft, will continue this proud tradition.
As soon as we roll out of the vehicle assembly building, High Bay 3, and the world gets a chance to see this rocket, I think it is going to be shocking.
On March 17th, NASA took a giant step toward returning humanity to the moon. The fully assembled Space Launch System rocket and Orion spacecraft for the Artemis 1 mission made its debut outside the massive vehicle assembly building.
We've seen the mobile launcher outside, and it's massive, but now add an over 300-foot rocket on top of it, it's just going to be amazing.
Charlie Blackwell Thompson oversees the launch countdown, ultimately providing the go for launch.
Entity, launch director, representing this team and all the men and women that have worked to make this day happen, I proudly give you a go to roll the Artemis launch vehicle to the pad.
Ladies and gentlemen, the world's most powerful rocket right here.
Once outside, the rocket began its nearly 4-mile journey to the pad, riding atop a 6.6 million pound crawler transporter, which was originally constructed to transport the Apollo moon rocket.
In 1 year, we have completely stacked the vehicle. We completed most of our testing, all very successful, and we are so close to launch, and the excitement is just crazy.
Now NASA's new moon rocket is making the same journey the Saturn V took 50 years ago.
And just as all eyes are on the SLS tonight as it makes its journey, in a few short weeks, all eyes are going to be on the sky as it rocks the space coast and takes its maiden flight around the moon.
It is amazing to see the culmination of all of this work of many years from many industries and many people that have come and go, to have a chance to then now see their work going over to the pad and then launching to go to the moon.
The rocket is rolling to historic Launch Complex 39B, its launch pad used for both Apollo and shuttle launches, sending hundreds of astronauts to space throughout the decades, and now on tap to send hundreds more as we return to the moon and venture beyond to Mars. But for this mission, there will be no astronauts on board. Before the uncrewed Artemis 1 stack can launch to our nearest celestial body, it has to travel to the pad for a wet dress rehearsal, a test to run the rocket, capsule, launch team, and launch pad through their paces, simulating a launch countdown.
When we get to the pad team will be connecting all the interfaces between the pad and the mobile launcher so that we can go ahead and start our operations at the pad. So at that point, the launch director really takes over, and she will go down the sequence as if it was really a normal launch day.
Wet dress rehearsal is essentially launch without a launch. It is to really, the reason we're doing it is to verify and validate all of the pieces that go into launch countdown. So wet dress is really our opportunity to find any issues or adjustments that we need to make in our launch countdown.
For Artemis 1, the wet dress rehearsal is the final and most critical test before the rocket can return to the launch pad for liftoff to the moon. During the countdown, over 730,000 gallons of supercooled liquid propellants will be loaded into the rocket as part of the nearly 2-day launch countdown.
We will configure all of the ground systems exactly the way we would for launch, and we will fully load the core stage and the interim cryopropulsion stage with their liquid fuels. That'll be the first time that that's been done from here at Kennedy Space Center. There have been pieces of these things done in multiple different areas. We've tested all of these systems in multiple different locations, but this will be the first time where we pull it all together into all of it all in the same progression that we've got laid out for launch countdown.
Wet dress is the biggest milestone we have aside from launch, because that means that the rocket is now put together, has been tested separately and together, and it is ready to go and be filled with fuel to simulate how we're going to do it at the pad. And then it tells us the rocket is ready to go for launch.
And behind that wet dress rehearsal is a launch team made up of hundreds of engineers monitoring each system of the 320-foot tall Artemis 1 rocket and capsule. Sitting in firing room 1 is the core launch control team, monitoring hundreds of launch commit criteria to ensure the ground systems and flight hardware are ready for launch.
Now, you would think that launch control team in firing room 1 is it. That's all you need. We have an expansive support team across really the entire NASA enterprise that is supporting us on launch day.
And that support spans the entire nation, from additional systems engineers sitting in Kennedy's Firing Room 2, to the flight control team at Johnson Space Center in Houston, to the contractors responsible for designing and building each segment of the rocket and capsule.
This team is really shaping up to be a great, very skilled, and ready to operate and execute launch for Artemis 1.
With the Artemis 1 launch team now fully certified and the wet dress rehearsal complete, SLS and Orion are ready for their final pit stop, returning to the VAB before venturing back to Launch Pad 39B for liftoff.
I mean, we are going and we're going together, and we're having an opportunity to do this in a new generation of space exploration in which I can say that I'm honorably a part of.
You know, you come every day to the VAB and you see the rocket and you can't believe what we have accomplished.
People throughout history have always explored, and you never know what you're going to learn.
Exploration is not always about the destination, but it's the path that you travel, the things you learn along the way.
And the things we're going to learn are going to be incredible. We can't even begin to understand what those are today.
Our workforce has been a relentless spirit. We imagine, we build, we never stop pushing the envelope of what is possible.
NASA is preparing for a journey back to the moon, and after that, we're setting our sights on Mars. To get there, we need tons of rocket power coming from our Space Launch System.
When it comes to how much power this thing can push out, this thing is massive.
It's going to be mesmerizing to stand next to this massive vehicle. The immensity of it, knowing that this thing is going to be propelling a rocket into space and around the moon.
Hang on, it's probably best to start back at the beginning. It all started in Promontory, Utah, where Northrop Grumman manufactured each of the segments that make up the rocket's boosters. After a 10-day cross-country journey, the booster segments were delivered to Kennedy Space Center's Rotation, Processing, and Surge Facility, or RPSF. If this all sounds familiar, that's because it's the same facility that was used to process shuttle booster segments, which all came from Utah. Then they're ready to go to the iconic Vehicle Assembly Building, or VAB, where the rest of the motor segments are assembled and stacked on top of the mobile launcher.
So the one thing about this vehicle, of course, it's produced all across the country. Components all come here. They may be built around the country, but they all come together right here in the Vehicle Assembly Building.
Our SLS rocket will generate 8.8 million pounds of thrust to break through Earth's gravitational pull. That's more power than the space shuttle and the Saturn V rocket used. Teams with NASA's Exploration Ground Systems are responsible for assembling the boosters that will house the majority of that power. The twin solid rocket boosters, made up of 10 total motor segments, will stand nearly 17 stories when fully stacked. First, teams will inspect and prep the hardware. Next, they're ready to start stacking the segments, a process that takes time, patience, and a steady hand.
Once we have everything done in High Bay 4, we pick up the segment with the 325 crane, pick it up over the 16th floor crossover to where you see it now, and we begin stacking the segments. Each segment, we lift over the 16th floor crossover and stack it. Once we stack it, we put it on top of the segment below, and we put about 177 pins all the way around the whole thing to attach each segment.
And the pressure to perform the operation flawlessly can test the team's nerves.
There's a tremendous responsibility involved with processing flight hardware like this. It's nerve-wracking at times, but it's exciting. There's zero appetite for risk in a program like this.
We have a bunch of shuttle guys that are here to show us along the way. You know, if we get stuck, they're there to guide us. At the beginning of stacking, it was very nerve-wracking. You know, with each segment that we stacked, a little bit of the nerve comes off. By the third or fourth one, it's easy peasy. You know, we're pushing through, all the jitters are gone, and we're just excited to get finished with it.
With all 10 booster segments now fully stacked on the mobile launcher, there's just one final piece of the puzzle to round out the power needed to get SLS off the ground and send it to space. Core stage. After a 900-mile journey aboard NASA's Pegasus barge, the SLS core stage, the largest rocket stage NASA has ever built, has made it to Kennedy Space Center.
Today is a huge day. This is the last piece of big hardware that we need for Artemis 1 processing. And we've just been waiting a long time for this part of the vehicle to arrive so that we can get going on the next steps of our stacking operations.
Standing an impressive 212 feet tall and weighing a whopping 188,000 pounds, the core stage came all the way from Stennis Space Center in Mississippi. The core stage went through round after round of rigorous testing, including what's called its Green Run series, truly putting its performance to the test. The series involved 8 rounds that looked at systems individually before culminating in pure power. With over 700,000 gallons of propellant flowing through the core stage and its RS-25 engines firing for 8 minutes straight, the successful final test resulted in some big emotions from the team.
We cried, we laughed, and we cheered because it was so emotional to see, the years of culmination coming through.
And that victory did not come without overcoming a few challenges, proving why at NASA we test as frequently and as hard as we do.
And we got to shut down. All personnel.
So we actually did a 1-minute test on the first hot fire test. And then we learned a lot from that. We understood the vehicle more, we made a few changes, and then we got back into our second hot fire test.
There was a lot of joy and workmanship and ownership of being able to work that process and be able to get it done. When we went for the second hot fire and we went for the 500 seconds, that was just pure exhilaration.
Following its arrival at Kennedy, teams moved the core stage into the VAB, where it was lifted by a crane and placed in between the twin solid rocket boosters. Serving as the backbone of the rocket, the core stage will provide more than 2 million pounds of thrust to help send the Orion spacecraft on its trip around the moon.
Essentially, we have these 2 massive cranes that are located inside of the VAB, where we go ahead and we pick 2 points at the end of the core stage, one on the back portion of it and on the front portion of it. We lift it up to the point where we're able to transition it from a horizontal position over into a vertical position, and then essentially bring it way up to the top of the vehicle assembly building and cross it over into High Bay 3, in which we ensure that we don't damage any part of the vehicle as it's incoming into its position.
NASA's largest rocket stage, now fully integrated with the twin boosters, is ready to get Orion off the Earth. But it will take one more critical component to give the capsule that extra push it needs to journey tens of thousands of miles beyond the moon. With just a single RL-10 engine, the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, or ICPS, will provide over 20,000 pounds of thrust to send Orion on the ride of a lifetime. To connect the ICPS with the rocket stack, teams next added the launch vehicle stage adapter to the core stage, followed by the ICPS.
The ICPS is the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, and essentially it's somewhat of the upper stage of the entire SLS vehicle. And what that will do is propel the Orion capsule along with its service module over to its destination, which at this point in time will be the moon.
But before the spacecraft can be attached to the rocket, teams will conduct a series of tests to ensure all of SLS's components communicate properly with one another, plus the ground systems equipment, the launch control systems, and its software. Adding to the challenge, those methods for testing have changed significantly since the days of the Apollo program. Initially built in the 1960s to house assembly of the Saturn V, the VAB has undergone some major modifications to support several different kinds of rockets and spacecraft, whether they're going into low Earth orbit or venturing to deep space.
This high bay was shuttle heritage. Before that, it was Apollo heritage. So there's upgrades that are still occurring today to include upgrades that will support Artemis 2 and Artemis 3.
When SLS blasts off from Kennedy's Launch Pad 39B, Orion isn't the only thing it will be sending to space. Hitching a ride with Orion are tiny shoebox-sized satellites called CubeSats that were loaded into the Orion stage adapter in Kennedy's Space Station Processing Facility. The extra room in the stage adapter provides a rare opportunity to send those CubeSats to deep space to conduct science and research of their own. And these CubeSats are on tap to study a range of topics, from the moon to asteroids to the effect of space radiation on living organisms. At this point, the stack is nearly complete. All that's missing is the spacecraft itself, which has been in the Launch Abort System facility, getting outfitted with one of the spacecraft's most crucial pieces.
The launch abort system is kind of that pointy solid rocket motor that's at the top of Orion, and it's there to protect the crew in the event of an emergency, so it's a very important system.
Fully integrated with its launch abort system, the Orion spacecraft slowly makes its way to the VAB in the overnight hours. Upon its arrival, teams carefully lift and lower it onto the Orion stage adapter. With this operation, stacking the most powerful rocket the world has ever seen is complete. And what a sight to behold.
We're trying to decide, what does exploration look like in the future when we retire shuttle? You know, what does our nation want to do? Where do we want to go? How do we want to explore? To see it go from those days of words and ideas in people's heads to the 3 programs we have today and the Artemis mission and all the hardware that's been produced in factories ranging from big aerospace companies to little mom and pop shops all over the country and the world. It's unbelievable, and I'm just really proud.
Before SLS and Orion can launch our nation into a new era of space exploration, a series of tests needs to take place inside the VAB, validating the rocket and spacecraft as an integrated system and paving the way for one final milestone: wet dress rehearsal. The 322-foot-tall, fully integrated rocket will roll out to Launch Pad 39B for a full test, allowing the launch team to run through a full launch countdown, but stopping just short of firing the engines.
I think we're going to be so proud when it rolls out of the VAB. I will personally be probably crying a little bit because it's such a big event. We worked so hard to get us to the day of rolling out. I'm probably going to be bawling when we launch it. See it through my tears because it's just a culmination of so much work from everybody.
We owe the advancement of science and research and technology to what we're doing here. And this is a big opportunity for us as a nation to reclaim our spot at the forefront of human space flight and exploration.
Artemis is going to be a major part of history. It most definitely is going to rock the space industry when it flies. This program is going to go to the moon. It's going to go to Mars. We need that. This country needs that. This world needs that.
I'm so excited. It's going to be a lot of work ahead of us, but Artemis 1 is going to surprise everybody.
Hi, everybody. Since I've been back from space, I've accumulated a lot of fan mail.
What a crazy year 2020 has been. But the fan mail still comes in. NASA mission keeps going on.
Fan mail's been really important to me. I always make a point to answer my fan mail.
I've collected some of my favorites in a photo album.
Now, like many of you, I don't come into work physically very often. It has been a year of remote working. I stopped by my office today because I wanted to get some things done, and I hadn't checked my mailbox in 8 months. And so I just walked into a giant stack of mail because clearly all of you guys have still been writing your letters. So I have decided I'm putting off my work for today because hearing from you is way more interesting. So I thought maybe you'd like to join me in reading some of this mail. So let's get started.
Let's see what we got. How does laundry work in space? Do you have the general washers and dryers like on Earth, or is it completely different? Actually, we don't have any washing machines, no dishwashers, no laundry, none of that. We don't have the capacity to do that on the space station. Perhaps other future spacecraft might have that capability, but right now we don't. So we wear our clothes for a certain amount of time, and then when they're a little bit too dirty to wear anymore, then we take new ones.
So my first piece of mail comes from North Bend, Washington, and it says, "Attention aliens. Do not fear, do not attack. I do come in peace. Doa Mijik." Thank you, Doa.
This is one of my favorites. It's from Elena. It says, "Dear Mr. Morgan, hello, my name is Elena. I'm 8 years old. I go to a school named Math and Science Academy. I'm in 3rd grade. I'm Cuban and Puerto Rican and Cuban, and I would love to be a doctor when I'm older. I also want to be a famous person."
Dear Astronaut Kim, my name is Ben. I'm in the 3rd grade. Space interests me with rocket ships, planets, and science. How big can asteroids get? We actually just had a recent mission called OSIRIS, where we landed a spacecraft onto a near-Earth asteroid called Bennu. Now, Bennu is not the biggest asteroid in our solar system. Asteroids can be really, really large or more on the smaller side like Bennu.
Moving on to the questions. What made you become an astronaut? Have you ever seen an alien? When you use the bathroom, when you flush the toilet, where does it lead?
Here is a future poet, future novelist, artist who has written a poem, "Jump off my bed and into space, stars and planets all over the place. There's the moon, there's the sun, space is so much fun. But gravity pulls me back to the station. I wish this wasn't my imagination." It is good that gravity pulls us back to something, especially the space station. Don't want to go floating off into space anywhere. We have a safety tether for that, actually.
Oh my goodness, we got an astronaut application. This is from Elise Basham, and it says, "Why would you like to be an astronaut?" "Because I want to see what Earth looks like on the outside." That's a good goal. "Why will you be a good astronaut?" "Because I like space." Well, Elise, I think you meet the basic requirements. I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to our chief astronaut.
First question here is from Devin Yarklitz, and he wants to know what my favorite spacesuit is. Each spacesuit is needed for its particular job. Just in case the capsule that we're in has a leak or something, we're protected. And that's a good thing because that's what spacesuits do. They protect us. When we go up and down, either on the space shuttle or the Soyuz or the new spaceships coming, we have to wear a launch and entry suit. The American launch and entry suit is called ACES. It looks like this, and it's orange. We have a big helmet, and it's pretty big. The Russian on the Soyuz, the Russian spacesuit called Sokol, it is a really neat spacesuit. It's a lot lighter weight, and it fits into the compact area that we get inside the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. If we decide to go outside, we have to wear a spacewalking spacesuit. And we got two different types aboard the space station. One is the American Extravehicular Mobility Unit, or the EMU. You can see it right here. It's white. We wear different color stripes depending on who's the EV1 and EV2, so we can tell each other apart because we all look very similar in the spacesuits. And then the Russians have an Orlan. I had the chance to go in a Russian spacesuit. It's a lot like the American EMU. So those are 4 different spacesuits plus this flight suit. Great question.
This one's one of my favorites. Gives you an idea of how big our spacesuits are. They really are. And I think this astronaut is on an asteroid or maybe the moon. Either way, that's pretty cool. Anyone who wrote one of these fan mail letters from elementary school, they could be the one walking on the moon or walking on an asteroid someday.
How long does it take to go back home? How long does the food last? What does it feel like when you're floating? Bye. Hope you enjoyed what you read. Sincerely, Elena.
I mean, did this even have postage, or did the post office just bring it?
If you have a moment and could share your advice as an astronaut and successful woman of science to a young girl who cannot stop talking about all the experiments she wants to conduct when she lands on Mars, we would be forever grateful. Well, Ileana, I would say keep up that excitement, and the most important thing is to keep asking questions. Keep that curiosity alive to explore, to study, to learn about science, technology, engineering, math. Follow what it is that you're passionate about. Your dreams can come true. I know that for a fact.
Greeting, astronaut apps. I'm a high school physics and astronomy teacher at Ridgeline High School. I would like to start a wall of astronaut photographs adjacent to the display of my space patch collection. And she has a photo of all the patches that she has on the wall. Well, Emma, as a super teacher, you're continuing to inspire the younger generation. I'd like to thank you for your work. Thank you for the hard task that you have. Woo-hoo to teachers. Woo-hoo.
Dear astronaut Dr. Kim, my name is Gracie. I'm in the 3rd grade. I thought it was funny how you got called in the grocery. If I got called there, I would go crazy. We went crazy too. I was in the grocery store with my wife when I got the call from the selection committee that I was selected as an astronaut, and it was a very memorable time.
Hi, my name is Carolyn. I go to Charlotte Preparatory School in Charlotte, North Carolina. Did you know that my middle name is McLean? Stop. That stop the film. Track this girl down, bring her to NASA. Your middle name is McLean. It's spelled the same way. You go to Charlotte Preparatory School. Charlotte's my middle name. And you wrote me on my launch day. Holy cow.
Ah, what a beautiful card. It's a unicorn dog. You're more amazing than a dogacorn. That is quite a compliment, Jory. Thank you so much. This is beautiful.
Look at this one. This is so colorful and pretty. This one is even on both sides. Look, it has all the planets. It has Pluto there. Ah, yeah. After my own heart, there's Pluto at the bottom.
Got some real artists out there. This is Lucas, 3rd grade. Did a great job of depicting our entire solar system. I love it because Pluto is still there.
Is Pluto a planet, or did Pluto explode? As far as I know, Pluto has not exploded.
I think that's it.
Thank you so much for the fan mail. It means a lot to us.
Thank you, everyone, for your letters.
I am so thankful that everybody took the time to write me on this Thanksgiving, and it's going to take me forever to go through all of these, and I love it. Thank you.
Thanks for the letters. Thanks for all the questions. Keep them coming. We love it. We love it.
It is so nice to see all of this fan mail and to know that everybody is thinking about us here at NASA, especially during the holidays.
From the entire astronaut corps, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Have a happy holiday and happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thanks for the mail, and keep it coming.
Happy Thanksgiving from Johnson Space Center, everybody.
By the way, we just got to 1 million followers on Twitter. Couldn't do it without you. Tweet us your fan mail questions. Hashtag Ask NASA. Hashtag NASA. Hashtag Dragon. Hashtag Spacewalk. Hashtag Artemis. Hashtag Starliner. Hashtag the universe.
believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space. And none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Welcome to Introduction to the Moon. This is the first lecture in the Moon 101 series, and it's designed to give you a brief overview of a lot of different subjects about the moon that other lecturers will go into in more detail in the successive lectures. My name is Dean Epler. I'm a retired NASA lunar geologist, and I'm presenting this material, although it was originally put together by Paul Spudis, the scientist who originated the whole Moon 101 concept about 10 years ago. Paul has passed away, and I'm trying to fill in for him, hopefully in such a way that he will not be disappointed. So the first important part that we need to discuss is really what the moon is. And the real key, I think, is that the moon is a planet. It has many of the features that we think of as a planet, as in having a core, having a mantle, having a crust. No other planet is as proportionally large as the moon is with respect to the size of the Earth. Many of the other planetary bodies that have moons, such as Mars, have small irregular moons that seem to be just sort of, accidentally captured into the orbit of their primary body. The moon has a heavily cratered surface. It is partially flooded by lava flows, which erupted somewhere between 4 billion and about 1 billion years ago, with the bulk of the lava being emplaced around 4 to 2.2 billion years ago. Since the moon has formed, there have been many impacts by comets and asteroids, and they have radically altered the outer surface of the moon. It has created what is a chaotic upper layer of debris, which we call regolith, and it has deeply fractured the lunar crust to a depth of over 10 kilometers. By and large, the moon was a dead planet by about 1 billion years ago. There's a lot we don't know about the history of the moon, and some of these unknown items are key to understanding the history of the Earth-Moon system. The moon is covered by a particulate blanket, and I say particulate blanket because it is really a mix of particle sizes all the way from extremely tiny sizes all the way up to boulders that are the size of a building. It is easily accessed. It is a likely feedstock for resource extraction. And if you look at the picture of John Young's feet, this picture was taken on Apollo 16, you'll see that there is actually fluffy dirt regolith kicked up around it. And it gives you a nature of how loose and fluffy the upper layer of the regolith is. But in the upper right corner, you see the picture of an extremely small, but nevertheless almost perfect crystal of a mineral. The moon's regolith is full of things like this. As I said, it goes all the way from large rocks down to the finest fraction that you can imagine. I want to go into some general properties. On the left is the moon, in the center is Mars in red, and on the right is Earth in blue. And if you compare the numbers for any given variable across the graph, you're going to see that the moon and Mars are actually a lot more like each other than Mars is like the Earth. A lot of people have taken the view that Mars is more like the Earth, and to a certain extent, that's justified in light of what we think the early Martian history is now, in that we think it was warm and it was wet. But the size of the planet, its composition, its very nature makes it actually a lot more like the moon than it is like Earth. The moon has a history. Before Apollo, it was dubbed the Rosetta Stone of the planets. And after Apollo, in the immediate years after Apollo, a lot of people sort of wondered, well, was it really? But as time has gone on, and as we've analyzed lunar samples, we've come to believe that moniker, in fact, is absolutely correct. And much of what we understand now about the other planets in the solar system as well as the Earth. We've learned because the moon has preserved a history that many other planets no longer have. Now, before we went to the moon on Apollo with human beings, we had quite a bit of precursor missions from the United States. In addition to that, the Soviet program landed a considerable number of spacecraft on the surface, as well as flew vehicles around it. Before we could even think about landing on the moon, we had to understand what the moon was actually like on its surface. And it's really important to recognize that before these vehicles went to the moon, the smallest thing we had ever seen on the lunar surface through terrestrial telescopes was about 1 kilometer on a side. And the questions we had before we sent these spacecraft there seem somewhat silly now, but there were things like, where do craters run out? Are the craters all the way down to the smallest size? Are there rocks on the surface? Is the surface capable of bearing the weight of a lunar module? All of these things now we understand, perfectly well. But before we went to the moon with people on Apollo, we didn't know any of that. And this set of robotic missions clarified that. And I'm going to talk about each one in turn. The first successful spacecraft that basically touched the moon was the Ranger series. The Ranger series were hard landers in that they had no other, I suppose you could say, objectives other than hitting the surface and imaging the surface all the way down. As such, the only thing they did was photograph the surface. But this was really key because prior to the Ranger set of missions, we simply had no idea what the surface was like at a human scale. Ranger answered a tremendous number of questions that, frankly, we had had since Galileo first turned his telescope to the moon. There was a whole variety of soft landers, which, for obvious reasons, did a lot more when they got to the surface than the Ranger did. The Surveyor was an American mission. It flew 7 total spacecraft in the series, of which I believe 4 were successful. The whole purpose of the Surveyor missions was to safely soft land on the moon, to understand the nature of the lunar surface, and to do some basic chemical analysis. But largely it was, and you can think of it as largely a civil engineering mission. What we wanted to know is, A, can we land on the moon? Is it possible to have a spacecraft, fly to the lunar surface and survive? The second thing is, what is the surface like? Is it soft? Is it a hard rock? What is it like? Is it like a snowbank that will disappear into? And the Surveyor was an incredibly successful set of missions that we're still analyzing data from. The Soviets, in addition, flew 3 sample return missions to the moon in the 70s. The Luna 16, 20, and 24 missions not only brought back samples from places we did not go on Apollo, they did it robotically. And at this point, no other country on the Earth has robotically recovered a sample from the lunar surface. In addition, the Soviets landed 2 Lunokhod rovers, which were incredibly successful. They drove around the moon's surface, again, in places that the Apollo missions hadn't gone. And the 2 sets of Soviet missions greatly enhanced what we understood from Apollo by simply providing complementary samples from other places on the moon the Apollo program did not get to. Lastly, Lunar Orbiter was another really key mission because it circled the moon and photographed about 75% of the surface. At that, up to the point of the Lunar Orbiter missions, the only real global view of the moon that we had was from telescopic observations, and telescopic observations that simply do not see the lunar far side. Lunar Orbiter was a mapping mission. It was intended to collect global mapping data that the Apollo program could use in planning landings. Now, recently, and I say recently within the last 10 years or so, we have been flying, not just we, the United States, but the human race has been flying a significant number of orbital missions around the moon. Countries that had never done this before, like China, Japan, India, have flown a number of really successful missions and again have enhanced our understanding of the moon's surface. In addition to that, The Chinese have landed a soft lander with a rover in a manner not dissimilar from the Lunokhod missions. Okay, the first mission I want to take a look at is Selene. This was flown by the Japanese Space Agency. It carried a variety of instruments on board with three general objectives. First was to photograph the surface. Before the Selene mission went, we did not have any better resolution of the surface than we had on Apollo. The Selene mission improved that considerably. In addition to that, it carried geochemical remote sensors, basically instruments that could look down at the surface and capture radiation that would tell us what the composition of the lunar surface was. And in addition to that, it carried instruments to look at the nature of space at the orbital altitude of the spacecraft. Chang'e 1 was a Chinese instrument. It carried much or similar payloads and had similar goals to the Kaguya Selene mission. And it was doing essentially two big missions. One was to look at the lunar surface and to get good images and good altimetry. And the second was to collect remote sensing data on the composition of the surface as well. Chang'e 2 was similar to Chang'e 1, but it was primarily directed toward looking at the landing site for the Chang'e lander. So it was essentially a reconnaissance mission for a very specific spot on the lunar surface. Once it completed its mission, it left lunar orbit and went to the Earth Lagrange point 2, and then went from there on an asteroid expedition. So it was an extremely capable spacecraft, and it is still flying. Chandrayaan was a mission that was flown by the Indian Space Agency, but included payloads not only from the Indian Space Agency, but from the United Kingdom, from ESA, and from the United States as well. Again, collecting more and more detailed information about the lunar surface, similar in a way to the other satellites. Now, the first one that I think is really critical from the United States is something called GRAIL, Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory Mission. GRAIL was a spacecraft, or actually a pair of spacecraft, whose mission was to map out the lunar gravity field in incredible detail. And the idea behind this spacecraft was that the two co-orbiting spacecraft could determine the difference between themselves to an accuracy of about 1 micron, or 1,000th of a meter. As that distance between the two spacecraft changed, that indicated that there was a change in the gravity field felt at orbit. And that in turn allowed us to do an incredibly detailed gravity map of the moon. Once it got its primary mission done at a particularly high altitude, they stepped the orbit down and got increasingly detailed data at lower and lower altitudes until, in fact, the spacecraft ran into the surface. Because the moon's gravity field is unusual, it's lumpy, we tend not to fly spacecraft close to the moon early on in a mission because it's very easy to have the spacecraft impact. So many spacecraft will be flown at a higher altitude initially and then flown lower once we have a good data set. Another specific mission flown by the United States was a spacecraft called LADEE. Several times in the course of the Apollo program, we thought we may have seen particulate materials high in lunar orbit, and that remained a mystery as to what actually the high altitude environment was, particularly with respect to lunar dust. And the LADEE mission was flown to essentially look for lunar dust and to understand the nature of that high altitude environment. Lastly, and perhaps the most successful of all the missions, is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was flown initially in the Constellation program, and essentially what it was doing was collecting all the data we felt we needed to plug holes in both the lunar map and our concept of global variations in things like topography and composition. LRO was originally planned to be a 1 to 2 mission. It is still in orbit. It's been there for 8 years, and it has returned some of the most phenomenally accurate and detailed photographs of the lunar surface that have ever been recovered. and they have changed many of the ways we think about the lunar surface. The only lander that has been on the surface since Apollo is the Chinese U-2 lander, which was carried to the surface as part of the Chang'e 3 spacecraft. It landed in Mare Imbrium, about 40 kilometers southwest from a crater called Laplace F, and it operated for approximately 2 lunar days on the surface. It was really important because it deployed to an area we did not go on Apollo, and in addition to that, it deployed instruments that we simply didn't even have during Apollo, such as a ground-penetrating radar. And it has returned data that is revolutionary, and it was a magnificent mission. So I want to talk about some gross properties of the moon. And it's always important to start with what the moon looks like, both from the Earth and that part which we mostly cannot see, and that's the lunar far side. The moon has presented a variable face to humankind. Specifically, it's got dark and light areas. And the variations in albedo, the reflected light, whether they're bright or dark, it turns out tell us some very important things about the moon that we now know because of the various spacecraft that have been there. This is a series of lunar globes that look at 3 different elements: thorium, titanium, and iron. And I want to look at these in great detail, but one of the things I need everybody to recognize from this is that the albedo, the change in the gray tone of the lunar surface, actually maps very nicely to composition. This is the iron map of a goodly portion of the moon, and the variations range from brighter, warmer colors as higher iron and cooler, darker colors as less iron. Now, if you look at the moon in plain light, like we see the moon when we look up at it, you can see that the higher, brighter colors on the iron map correspond to the darker areas on the moon. And that's because the darker areas on the moon are filled with lava flows, and lavas are basaltic in composition, the same kind of rocks you see in Hawaii, and they tend to be higher in iron than the lighter color rocks on the rest of the moon. So we can see from that composition reflects albedo. Now, if we look at the titanium map, we see something very similar, although there are some variations in this. Not all basalts are alike. Some basalts have higher titanium, some basalts have lower titanium. The color scheme is the same as the iron map. Brighter colors have higher, lower colors have lower titanium. And you can see that not all the dark areas of the moon, the lavas, have the same titanium composition. We essentially discovered that from Apollo, from return samples. And we were lucky before we even knew this that we picked sites that coincidentally turned out to be places that had variations in titanium. But again, you can see on the western side of the moon and on sort of the central eastern side, we have a lot of titanium. In much of the rest of the moon, we don't have much titanium. Lastly, if we look at thorium, we see, again, the darker areas of the moon having a lot of thorium, and thorium is a radioactive element, and it's indicative of sort of evolved magmas that have spent a lot more time cooking, and that will be discussed in a later lecture. But again, if you go back to the picture of the moon that we see from the Earth, you can see that the concentrations of thorium match many of the colors that we also see on the lunar surface. In this case, they map to some place that we call the Procellarum creep terrain, where creep, K-R-E-P, stands for potassium, rare earth elements, and phosphorus. Let's talk about the lunar surface environment. And there's really 4 parameters that I think are really important. One is temperature and sunlight. The 2 are paired. And the other 2 are hydrogen content and what you can see of the Earth and how easy it is to communicate. The temperature on the moon really divides the moon into 2 different regimes. One is polar, which are colder, just like the Earth. And the other is the nonpolar environments, where, depending on where the sun is, it'd be hot or cold, just like the Earth. At noon, we get the hottest temperatures. On the moon, at noon, we get the hottest temperatures. When the sun goes down on most of the moon, it gets quite cold at night. The poles, on the other hand, are colder, but the temperature is much more stable than it is on the rest of the moon. Let's talk a little bit about hydrogen content. Hydrogen is a really critical element for essentially living off the moon. You can combine it with oxygen to make water. You can use it as rocket fuel. So where the hydrogen is really important. The non-polar portions of the moon, the hydrogen ranges from as low as 10 parts per million to as many as 90 parts per million. The poles, however, we're pretty sure that the hydrogen content on average is greater than 150 parts per million. And it's why the poles remain an attractive target for lunar settlement. Lastly, direct to Earth communications. The moon is in locked rotation with the Earth. And that means that basically wherever you are in the lunar near side, the Earth will be in sight and it'll always stay in the same place. At the poles, the Earth is really low to the horizon. If the terrain isn't in the way, you can see it all the time, much as you do from the front side. But there are many times when the terrain may block it. The lunar far side never sees the Earth. So if you're going to operate on the lunar far side and you want to talk to the Earth, you're going to need a continuous relay satellite. So let's talk in more detail about thermal conditions, because the temperature is what we're going to have to work in when we're on the lunar surface. Nighttime surfaces are very cold, down to as cold as 150 degrees centigrade. And noontime temperatures are equally high, about 100 degrees centigrade. Polar areas are either always dark or have grazing solar incidence. So there are areas that we refer to as the permanently shadowed areas. These areas are extremely cold. In fact, many people have estimated that these are the coldest places in the solar system. The permanently shadowed areas on the moon never see the sun and probably have not seen the sun for hundreds of millions of years. Consequently, they are extremely cold, down to 50 to 70 degrees Kelvin. Another critical part of the lunar environment is micrometeorites. First, there's no atmosphere to impede the impact of all debris. So the speed at which, or the velocity at which it's coming in from space around the moon is not attenuated at all as it is on the Earth. There's a variable flux. I'm not going to repeat all the numbers on the graph there, but basically the smaller the object, the more there are of them. A lot of surface rocks have craters that are on the order of 1 to 10 microns. That's the size of the crater. In many cases, the damage from the impact extends far away from that actual crater, and it creates something we call zap pits. The Apollo astronauts noticed zap pits on the surface rocks, and once the rocks were back, it turns out that it becomes a very useful piece of data as to how long a rock's been sitting on the lunar surface and whether it's been tumbled. In other words, does it have the same face always facing the sky, or has it been rolled around? If it hasn't been tumbled, the top surface will have a lot of zap pits. The undersurface won't. If it's been tumbled around, the undersurface will have zap pits. And it turned out we could actually determine how rocks were bouncing around on the lunar surface by looking at the zap pits. One critical part of the discussion of micrometeorites is that even though there's micrometeorites coming into the moon and they're not slowed down, the impact hazard on the lunar surface is estimated to be about 4 times less than in low Earth orbit. So the lunar surface environment is much safer in terms of micrometeorites than low Earth orbit, where International Space Station is. Now, the moon's orbit is pretty interesting. Like all bodies in the solar system, it's not in a circular orbit, it's in an elliptical orbit. And in this case, the perigee and apogee being the farthest it's away from the Earth and the perigee being the closest it is, vary by about 45,000 kilometers. One key part of the fact that the moon has an apogee and perigee is that the size of the moon is actually quite a bit different when it's as far away as it can get and as close as it can get. The one on the left is when the moon is as far away as it is from the Earth. The one on the right is its closest approach. And there is a considerable difference in the moon size. So when you step out at night and look at a full moon and you think, gosh, that's a lot larger than I remember it being, sometime in the past, it's not an optical illusion. That's actually happening, and it's because the moon is in an elliptical orbit. There's something we call the barycenter, and that is the center, the point at which the entire system rotates, and that's about 1,700 kilometers below the Earth's surface. It is not at the center of the Earth because the moon is actually quite heavy relative to the Earth. So that center of rotation is actually displaced from the center of the Earth. The moon has an orbital period of about a month. We know this because every month we go through a new moon and we go through a full moon and then back to a new moon. It is not exactly a month long, so there are months that come along where you get 2 full moons in the month, and that's why. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the moon's orbit and eclipses. They could be more common if all of the orbital parameters of the Earth and moon lined up. Basically, what happens to get an eclipse is that at the point of new moon, in other words, when the moon is located between the Earth and the sun, it's directly on what we call the Earth-Sun line. That is the line that's drawn essentially between the center of the Earth and the center of the moon. Because the moon's orbital plane is different from the Earth, and because that plane precesses around the Earth because of tidal and gravitational forces, those 3 conditions, Earth-Sun line and the moon right in that Earth-Sun line, don't happen very often. And so it's a special case of a new moon. If all of those were aligned every month, we'd have an eclipse, but we're not so lucky. Let's talk a little bit about something we call libration. The moon wobbles around its axis, and it actually has what we call longitudinal and latitudinal axis. Longitudinal libration means it's basically wobbling back and forth on its elliptical plane. Latitudinal means it's wobbling back and forth on its essentially north-south line. Because of that, we can actually see slightly into the far side and the poles of the moon if we didn't have libration. So about 8 degrees beyond the 90-degree west and 90-degree east points, and about 6.5 degrees beyond the north and south polar. If you look at these 2 photographs that were taken at different parts in the year, on the left photograph, there's the crater Endymion pointed out, and you can't quite see it, but Mare Crisium is the black crater essentially at the center. If you look at the picture on the right, Endymion has now shifted to the left and more into view, and Mare Humboldtium, which normally we would not see, we can see. Likewise, Mare Crisium is no longer right on the limb, but is slightly tilted toward the Earth, and that's just libration at work. Topography is an important thing that geologists think about in terms of a planet's history and its conditions, because it tells us a lot about how strong the crust is and what's happening on the interior. We now have a really, really good idea of what the topography of the moon is like. The moon is bumpy. It has extremes in elevation from as low as 9 kilometers below a established altitude and as high as 8 kilometers above that. Now, we have pictures like this, and we use blue, cooler colors as the lower, and yellow, red, and white as the higher altitudes. But one of the things that's really key is that the moon has elevations extremes that are essentially the same as the Earth, from the seafloor to the mountains. There's a couple of things that I think are important to talk about. One is, of course, the lunar near side has the traditional thing we think of as the man in the moon patches of dark, but it turns out, of course, these are also where the moon is low, and that's consistent. Lava flows, when they erupt, flow into lower spots, and we know now that those lower spots are the remnants of very large impact craters from the early on in the lunar history. The lighter areas are what we call the highlands in between the lower spots, and they're much elevated. Interestingly, if you look at the far side, on the lower part of the far side, we see this big dark blue area, and that's something called the South Pole Lake and Basin. That's generally acknowledged to be the largest impact crater in the solar system, and it's actually a pretty big hole on the moon, and we really didn't understand that it was there, although there were hints, until we had these kinds of maps more recently. In addition to the South Pole Aitken Basin, you can see at the equatorial part of the far side of the moon, we have our highest topography, again, up to about 8 kilometers above the agreed on datum. The topography of the moon is largely bimodal. In other words, you're either on the rough, lighter colored highland areas or the smooth, darker colored Maria. When we consider roughness, we're really talking in most cases about whether it's mountainous or not mountainous. And those are big scale things in terms of the terrain. But it's also important to consider whether we have roughness at a human scale, or in the case of going back to the moon, on a lander scale. And the highland areas turn out to be actually smoother at a lander scale, and the Maria are rougher at the lander scale. Lunar landforms are dominated by cratering. We talk a little bit about lava flows, but even the lava flows are affected by cratering because the lava flows are found filling craters. There are literally thousands of impact craters, ranging from the size of the South Pole Aitken Basin, which is 2,500 kilometers across, to the zap hits, which are microns across. The shape and form of an individual crater changes as a result of two things. One is the size. The larger craters tend to be flatter floored. The smaller ones tend to be more bowl-shaped. In addition to that, as a crater spends time at the lunar surface, in other words, it goes from being a young crater to an older crater, it gets more and more subdued till finally it's just barely there. Unlike the Earth, the terrain on the moon is not dominated by plate tectonics process. It is solely a function of where things have impacted and the volcanic events that have filled those areas. In any event, completely smooth, flat areas on the moon are rare. They occur in the Maria, but the Maria are fairly old, so they have been broken by numerous craters as well. The slopes in the Maria are around 4 to 5 degrees on average, so it's not very, very steep terrain. Although, as you can see, the crater in the center of this picture, if you get close to a young crater, the terrain gets quite a bit steeper. The Highland Maria boundary is generally sharp and abrupt, much as we see here at the Apollo 15 site in the Hadley Apennine region. Because of that abruptness of the boundaries is, again, why we see the dark Maria areas. If those boundaries were not abrupt, the Maria would not have that sharp, obvious image on the moon surface. The highland terrain consists largely of rolling hills, some of them quite high, but nevertheless not jagged, steep cliff faces like we see on terrestrial topographies. The highland terrains are created largely by overlapping ejecta blankets from large craters. If we get close to a young crater, for instance, like Tycho, the terrain is quite rough. But away from the young impact craters, the average slopes are 7 to 10 degrees, but the scale of the topography at, let's say, a lander image or a lander footprint is quite smooth. Surface lighting is something that not only we dealt with on Apollo, both in terms of operating on the lunar surface, but also seeing the topography for crews to land at, but also we'll be worried about it when we go back to the moon because we're there to stay. Apollo 12 had the shallowest sun angles, so 7.5 to 9.5 degrees, very shallow. Apollo 16 had the highest sun angles, 45 to 48 degrees. On the left is an Apollo 12 picture on EVA-1. You can see how long the shadow of the lunar module and the astronaut is. On the right is the Apollo 16 site at the highest sun angle. And in contrast, the surface is much brighter, the shadows are smaller. And in general, it's harder to see your way around on the terrain in high sun angles than it is in lower sun angles. Anybody that's ever been skiing in flat light knows that you can ski off some remarkable terrain that you didn't even see because the shadows aren't there. In some ways, driving around on the moon in high sun angles is going to be similar to that. And possibly when you drive, you're going to have to be tacking back and forth down sun. These are two pictures essentially looking up sun and down sun. Apollo 12 EVA-1 down sun, The sun is 7.5 degrees. So you can see if you're looking directly down sun, you don't see much. But if you look to the right or to the left, you can see quite a bit. And that's what I mean about having to tack back and forth around the sun. If you want to make sure you don't drive into something that's exciting, you're going to have to be careful how you drive. In contrast, Apollo 17 EVA, sun's about 16 degrees, and that's looking up sun. The terrain is somewhat easier to see, but it's still glaring sunlight when you're going directly into the sun. A unique aspect of working on the lunar near side in the dark is illumination by earthshine. Because the moon's orbit is locked and we always see the same face of the moon, the Earth always stays in the same spot in the sky. And when you have a full Earth, it's something like 80 times brighter than a full moon. At essentially lunar midnight, if you're out working under the Earth with a full Earth, it's as bright as about 8 o'clock on a summer evening on the Earth. So the reality is that when you're out at night in Earthshine, you'll be able to see just about everything you need to without artificial illumination. John Young once told me that not only was it bright enough to see the lunar surface from orbit with Earthshine, you could actually tell color differences and see individual craters with Earthshine. So Earthshine is going to be an asset that's really important for future lunar operations, unless, of course, you're on the far side. The far side, the Earth is never in view. So when the sun goes down on the far side, with the exception of starlight, it's going to be really dark. In addition to that, when we're working at the poles, because the sun is so low to the horizon and the Earthshine is so low to the horizon, you're almost always going to need some level of illumination so you just don't step into dark holes because of the low sun angle. Let's talk about regolith. Regolith is one of those aspects of the lunar surface that has received a lot of discussion over the years. There will be a further lecture just on regolith, but I want to touch on it here to give you an idea what it is. The basic definition of regolith, and this is a geologic definition, is the layer or mantle of loose, unconsolidated rock material of varied origin that rests on bedrock over most of the lunar surface. In other words, regolith is what happens if you take bedrock and just beat it up until it's just nothing but fragmental material. We use we use regolith on the Earth to talk about soils as well, but the moon is essentially just plain old rock. The regolith can be formed in place or it can be transported from adjacent locations. Generally speaking, if you pick up a handful of regolith at any one spot on the lunar surface, roughly 90% of the material in your hand is going to have been derived very locally. About 10% will have been transported in by meteorite impacts from other locations. There are a lot of processes that affect regolith formation. Obviously, the principal one that creates regolith is meteorite impact. It breaks up the bedrock into all sizes, and the variety and sizes of meteorites create variety and sizes of regolith. In addition to that, we have cosmic rays, we have solar wind, and those create variations in the regolith which have caused it to be quite different at a very, very small scale, and I'll leave that discussion to the subsequent lecture. The median particle size of regolith is about 40 to 130 microns. That's really small, and it's much smaller than we experience, for instance, when we're at the beach. 95% of the regolith is less than 1 millimeter, and if you're out the beach, the roughly average size of the sand is about 2 millimeters. So the moon is not going to be like a day at the beach. There are a lot of things in the regolith. There's a lot of things mixed up. It's ground broken rock, it's impact melt, it's bits and pieces of meteorites, so it's very variable. The graph shows the variation in the nature of the regolith at various landing sites, in this case, surveyor landing sites. And you don't need to take away real detailed specifics on this, but it's important to recognize that the regolith isn't the same all around the moon. As the surface gets older, in other words, it's been exposed to the lunar at the lunar surface for a longer period of time, it changes grain size, it changes character. So every landing site will be slightly different. When we landed the lunar modules on the regolith, we had a variety of essentially interactions between the regolith and the lunar module. First, moving around. And if you look at the upper left picture and the lower left picture, those are sort of striations, little ridges and troughs created in the regolith by the ejecta, by the exhaust from the lunar module. If you look at the upper right picture, you can see that in that case, the regolith was quite fluffy and the foot pad sank, probably 1 to 2 centimeters into the regolith. On the lower right picture, you can see that, in fact, the foot pad is just sitting on the regolith. So how compact and how fluffy the regolith varies from place to place. But none of it, in no place, is that fluffiness deeper than about 10 centimeters. There's been a lot of discussion about dust and what it does to astronauts and hardware and rovers and spacesuits and things like that. The picture is of Gene Cernan after EVA-3 on Apollo 17. He's just pulled his suit off, and you can see that he's got a lot of dirt on his face, not because the regolith came into the suit during his EVA, but because the suits, which you can see piled on the ascent engine cover in the background, were pretty dirty from walking around on the lunar surface. There's been a lot of discussion about levitated dust. There's been a lot of discussion about whether dust is a critical design issue that will cause failure if it's not followed or not paid attention to. Levitated dust has been suggested both by the horizon glow taken on the surveyor cameras and by photographs and notes made by Gene Cernan as the Apollo 17 command module approached the Terminator. There's been a lot of discussion, is dust levitated? Does it move around on the lunar surface? There's a couple of things we can look at to try and get some idea of whether there is a large-scale transport of dust on the surface. The first is on Apollo 11, 14, and 15, we put laser retroreflectors on the surface. Now, these were corner cube reflectors that were designed to reflect laser light back to the Earth. So if there's dust moving around, you would really expect those corner cubes to get covered. And even if they're not completely covered, you would expect to see some reduction in the signal strength coming from the moon over time. The Apollo 11 retroreflector has been on the moon now for over 48 years. The others somewhat less time. There has been no evidence of any degradation in laser signal over the lifetime of these arrays. So if there's dust moving around, it's not covering the retroreflectors. When we went to the moon on Apollo 12, we landed near the Surveyor 3, which had spent 31 months on the lunar surface prior to the arrival of the Apollo 12 crew. Although there was some dust coating on parts, the patterns on the coating indicated that the dust was blown onto the Surveyor either by the lunar module landing or by the engines of the Surveyor itself. Again, there was no evidence of dust having settled on the spacecraft from any other source other than the engine exhaust. In fact, there was even a study published where a research team looked at the Surveyor parts brought back to the Earth, and they saw no evidence that dust was on these parts except by blown on by the engine bells. Now, when we establish an outpost, because engine bells do blow dust around, we're going to have to be careful about where we land our spacecraft so that we don't spray dust all over our habitats, deployed equipment, and instruments on the surface. So in that case, we will have to accommodate the fact that if you have an engine coming past the surface, it's going to blow dirt around. There's been some discussion also about whether dust is moving in the Terminator. When the Terminator comes by, there's some suggestion that there are variations in the electrical current, which some people have suggested would cause dust to levitate. So I want to talk a little bit about that particular issue as well. And this concern was raised before Apollo, and Apollo, I think, provides us some pretty conclusive proof that it's not happening. The first, I think, that's really important is that the albedo gradients between the highlands and the mare, the highland rocks being lighter colored, the mare rocks being darker colored, are sharp and distinct. They're preserved at remote sensing scales, they're preserved at photographic scales, and the crews on the surface could see them. In the upper right, the right is a picture of the Apollo 17 site. You can see very clearly that the highland terrains are distinct from the mare fill in the valley. At the left, you have a geologic map from a publication in 2002 that shows by using remote sensing data that those albedo variations indeed represent compositional variations, and that there is no sense that there's a homogenization of the lunar surface from dust. Likewise, if you go up to orbital altitudes and look at things like the mare highland boundaries, in this case Mare Crisium, on the left you see the albedo picture, on the right you see the iron map, and again you can see clearly that iron does not bleed over into the highland terrain, that the boundaries, the albedo boundaries, are as sharp in the remote sensing data as they are in the visible light. LADEE was a spacecraft I talked a little about earlier as having been sent to the moon recently to look at whether there was a dust component in the high altitude lunar exosphere. And in fact, LADEE saw, while there was some tenuous dust, there was no evidence of electrostatically lost dust at high altitudes. Lastly, if a lot of dust was moving around, we would expect the rocks at the surface to be either covered in dust or at least have a mantle of dust. And there is no evidence on rocks that have been essentially exposed to the surface for hundreds of millions of years of any accumulated dust blanket. We conclude that lateral dust transport on the moon, if it happens at all, is very inefficient and is not coating the lunar surface with new dust every time the sunrise goes by. Let's talk briefly about the origin of the moon. We'll get into more detail in subsequent lectures, but there were three traditional modes that were advanced prior to Apollo. Some of these modes date back to literally Charles Darwin's grandfather. The first was what we call the fission model. The idea was that early on in the history of the Earth, when it was largely molten, and if it was rotating fast, mass dissimilarities would cause a bulge to be created, and you would essentially birth a moon from that mass distinction. Darwin's grandfather actually suggested that the Pacific Ocean was where that body came from. The second origin theory was that both the Earth and the moon essentially accreted in the same spot, but created two different bodies, what we call co-accretion. And lastly, we thought that potentially the moon was formed elsewhere in the solar system and was ultimately captured by the Earth when the moon in a different orbit came nearby. We know for sure that the moons of Mars, for instance, were captured in such a way that they're actually asteroids which were forced out of the asteroid belt and were captured by Mars and are now permanent satellites. So one of the outcomes of the Apollo program was we discovered that these models are, for the most part, wrong. And we did that on the basis of understanding that the moon had undergone a fairly violent early history, and by inference the Earth, and also by looking at similarities and differences between lunar samples and terrestrial rocks. After quite a few years, and I mean like a decade, more than a decade after Apollo, that length of time was necessary to really assimilate all the data and start to come up with new models of the formation of the moon. And what is now called the giant impact hypothesis is the reigning model for the creation of the moon. What we believe now is that very early in the solar system's history, in some cases no more than 10 to 15 million years after the formation of the solar system, a Mars-sized body impacted the early Earth. And it didn't have a straight-on impact, it had a glancing impact. That the energy of that impact destroyed the impactor, the Mars-sized body, and significantly disrupted the surface of the Earth, such that you created basically a ring around the Earth, created entirely of the impactor plus some of the Earth's crust. Over a relatively short period of time, they think on the order of less than 1 million years, that ring system coalesced to form the moon that we know now, and it has been evolving ever since. It's important to point out that before Apollo, we thought the moon was essentially a big dust ball. Very little in the way of history, very little in the way of internal processes, and at some level, a fairly boring object. But we now know that shortly after the moon was formed, the upper several hundred kilometers of the moon were melted, probably by a combination of impacts and the dynamic environment the moon was in at the time, and it created what has come to be known as the magma ocean. So if you can imagine an ocean, but not of water, of molten rock, you get an idea of what the early history of the moon was like. Shortly after that crust stabilized, we think around 3.9 to 4.2 billion years ago, the last remnants of large planetesimals, big rocks floating around the solar system that hadn't yet been swept into planets, impacted the moon. And these impactors created the big basins that we see now. Shortly after that, we had a massive eruption of basaltic lava. Those rocks are darker and heavier than the lighter anorthosites, and they filled in the large impact basins and largely gave us the picture of the moon that we see today. Since about 2.5 billion years ago, we think the moon has been largely quiescent, not much going on, except for an occasional impact. The smaller the rock hitting it, the more than there are. Occasionally there are big smacks like Tycho, but that's been the history of the moon ever since the end of the big period of volcanism around 1 to 2.5 billion years ago. And the real key thing about the moon, I think, is that it really has witnessed a lot of the history of the inner solar system and specifically the Earth-Moon system in a way that we can no longer see on the Earth. And consequently, it's not only an important scientific target, but it's a place where we'll learn how to live on planets other than the Earth as we move out into the solar system.
According to research by our Goddard Institute for Space Studies, July 2023 was 0.43 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than any other July in NASA's record and hotter than any other month in the global temperature record. NASA and partner agency NOAA discussed this and our changing climate during a news conference. According to NASA data, the 5 hottest Julys since 1880 have all happened in the past 5 years. Learn more at climate.nasa.gov. Researchers with the Aloft project have been using NASA's high-flying ER-2 aircraft to help them study lightning and its connection to the vast energy fields in our atmosphere. The ER-2 can fly above and as close to thunderclouds as safely possible to observe gamma ray activity within thunderclouds and collect detailed data that can advance the study of high-energy radiation emissions from thunderstorms. Our Aerocast flight campaign is a wind study that aims to help drones land safely on rooftop hubs called vertiports for future delivery of people and goods. The campaign uses drones, sensors, weather balloons, and other technology to measure wind at altitudes below 2,000 feet and collect other data to resolve unknowns that could hinder these types of flights. The campaign, which continues through this month, may also improve weather prediction. NASA is looking for middle and high school students across the country to submit experiment ideas to send on a high-altitude balloon or a rocket-powered lander test flight as part of the third TechRise Student Challenge. Led by NASA's Flight Opportunities Program and administered by Future Engineers, the challenge allows student teams to participate directly in designing and building experiments for suborbital flight.
You know, there's this big unknown. You're headed out into this alien landscape that's just completely hostile to you. And, you know, if you didn't have a nice ship and extremely warm clothes, you probably wouldn't be able to survive. And so Mosaic as a whole, it's a year-long drifting expedition. So it involves people from 20 different nations, about 600 scientists. It's a huge, massive effort meant to study the Arctic as a system, not just the ice, but things like the atmosphere, the ocean, biogeochemistry, all kinds of things in a way that allows us to look at what's happening throughout the course of the year. So we left Tromsø on September 20th. Took us 10 days or so between leaving port, sailing out, picking up some instrumentation, and then starting to sail into the ice pack and starting to search for the flow. It was really difficult to find the flow because we needed ice that was thick enough to support all our equipment. Some of it's very heavy, and to do this safely. And actually, one of the big surprises to me and a lot of people on board was just how thin the ice was. You'd get out on the ice, but it's dangerous. It's an alien landscape. It's cold. There's bears. The polar bear situation was really interesting. And kind of terrifying. When we were out on the ice and we were setting things up, taking measurements, the bears did come back 2 times when I was there. And they came to our camp and they were doing things like messing with the equipment and going through our site. So there it was different because they're more on the turf that we had set up. You know, this is our turf now, and now they're coming in, and I could see them in places that I had been. So we were very isolated on the polar stern, and we had very limited connectivity. We had an email account we could send 50 kilobytes a message. It was a big change for me and a lot of people said, you know, after a week or so, I didn't miss it anymore. And I was one of those people. I really appreciated being a bit more isolated for a while and experiencing life in a different way. Doing field work like this brought me right there to the ice. When I do my research, I use data like this from the data that's taken up close on the ice. Sometimes that's the only way to get information on the ice. Things like how dense is the ice or how dense is the snow. You can't do this remotely. But we can use this to do calibration and validation of ICET2 over the course of the year. So this is valuable for improving the retrieval techniques that we use for ICET2. For me to be on the ground and get that different look at the ice and the surface, it just helps me as a scientist come up with new ideas and to inspire me to use the data that I have and then think about this in a totally new way, in a different way.
Wherever, however, whenever. We're here, there. We're everywhere. NASA Space Communications and Navigation. Exploration enabled.
Mission and liftoff. Touchdown confirmed. Hello, United States.
To explore every phase of cosmic history.
It's a new era of pioneers, star sailors, thinkers, and adventurers.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
Let's go.
We have been given the scientific knowledge
the technical ability, and the material to pursue the exploration of the universe.
I'm Jessica Ariola, and I am the lead for public and digital engagement for the Quest mission. Me llamo Jessica Ariola y soy la líder de comunicaciones para los medios sociales y en persona. My role with the mission is to communicate using social media channels or in person at events. The Quest mission is seeking to change rules that essentially would enable commercial supersonic flights over land. So for me, that's really exciting because that means that I would get to go from Washington, D.C. to LA in half the time. So I could see my family maybe more often. I am a product of immigration. I was born and raised in Southern California. And because of that, I work on making sure that we have as many resources as we possibly can to also include the Spanish-speaking population. To be at, say, an event and be able to communicate to someone in Spanish, it's pretty rewarding to see someone light up and then just they're so appreciative. As a kid, I was pretty creative. I remember wanting to be an interior decorator or a fashion designer. I even thought I could maybe be a singer. Mind you, I can't sing. One of the milestones that I'm looking forward to with the Quest mission is first flight. Like, I cannot wait to see the X-59 in flight. I cannot wait to see it take off and see it in the air and really experience what it sounds like. So much of what we're talking about with the Quest mission is sound. So I can't wait to actually hear it or maybe not hear it.
My name is Matt Camlett. I'm the communications deputy for NASA's Quiet Supersonic mission. Our job as communicators is to provide a voice for NASA to communicate with the public, but also it's a two-way street. We provide a voice for the public to communicate with NASA. In a given week, we might be working on social media posts. We might also be working press conferences and delivering on-camera news about what NASA is doing and the status of our mission. We will be flying the X-59 over communities beginning in 2024. The public will be providing feedback to NASA based on their perception of the X-59 when it flies over their communities and the quieter sounds that it makes during supersonic flight. My start in communications really came from being a sports broadcaster at my junior college. From there, I went to doing play-by-play announcing for the Long Beach State Dirtbags baseball team. At CBS, I covered the Dodgers and the Lakers and the LA Kings, and got to learn from some of the giants in the industry, people like Vin Scully. Growing up in California, I've grown to love the outdoors and the beach and the ranches. That's what helps provide my balance with work. You can usually find me at the ranch with my horse, Vinny, an animal with that kind of personality. He's almost more my buddy than just my horse. To actually see this X-plane, this experimental aircraft coming together, it's striking knowing that you're looking at something that can change the future of flight for all of us forever. What's really, really cool about NASA's Quiet Supersonic mission is we're seeing a lot of different NASA centers across the country come together in one goal as one NASA. We're really excited about this mission. We believe in it down to our core, and it's also a heck of a lot of fun.
My name's Paul Deese. I'm in the propulsion group. I'm the deputy propulsion lead, and my main focus is the integration and test of the GE 414 engine into X-59. For the engine, in and of itself, X-59, wouldn't go anywhere without it. So for our job, it's making sure that all the air that's going into the engine is clean and gives the engine the air that it needs to produce thrust, and then shoot all those molecules out the back and push everything forward. One of our most precious resources as humans is time. And so this technology and this capability, I think, will be able to give people more time at wherever they're wanting to go.